So recently, I had the pleasure and honor of listening to a talk of yours, and then going, in the Guggenheim, and then going to see the installation at the top floor. And apparently, the head of security told you that visitors are taking longer to go through your exhibition than any other he's worked on. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, that's my favorite comment I could get, really. I think any exhibition is an experiment of in time and place and with audience. And you spend all this time making it work. And there's this amazing moment. I think all of us have this when we create something and then we introduce it to the public. And you just see it's always an experiment of how they're going to interact. And that's really what makes the work. So, having people slow down, pay attention, be in the moment, look, like really spend time looking is always my goal. Always interested in how you can change a museum space from being a place where you walk in and something's on a mantelpiece or, on a frame and it says it's important, you should know why, figure it out, to a place where you're really like discovering, you're in the moment of, asking questions, of remembering things, of recall, of, creating your own narratives that takes the time to really explore. And it's a process of discovery. And you're seeing things that way, not being told. So that's sort of evidence of that to me. And I love that. So it's really the best compliment I could get.
I mean, it was so fun as a lifelong New Yorker, being in the Guggenheim and knowing the person who had created the installation. I just had a blast. So thank you for allowing us to come to that. But in addition to me, you, of course, have another very important Aria in your life, your youngest daughter. And I'm also, a New York parent. And one of the reasons I think anyone is a New York parent is because they want their kids to engage in the sort of culture that we have all around us. What is the best way that you have found to engage your kids in New York museums, appreciate the museums? Was that hard? Was that easy? How do you instill that culture in your kids?
It's interesting. I had a friend who is in their 20s. I'm a little bit veering away, but someone said this to me just the other day, that a friend who was in their 20s who felt very lonely in LA, and they'd come to New York and they didn't have any friends, and they started by going to the museums. And there's something about being in a museum where you have a relationship with an object that it really talks to you about what it is to be human. I think that when you actually connect with a creative, something that's creatively made by another human being, whether it's in ancient Egypt or your peer in a contemporary art way, in the moment or in history, and you have a moment where you connect with humanity through an object, through an image, you have this kind of feeling of not being alone, and it doesn't actually have to be with a person. So museums are these incredible places where I think you connect with humans over time. And being in a space in New York, what's one of the things I do love about New York is the museums are packed. And so you're having this individual experience with objects, but you feel like everyone around you is too. So it becomes communal. So it's this moment of a live interaction with a physical object that is also communal. And I think that's something with so much being not time based. My daughter, speaking of Aria, I remember the first time we took a JetBlue flight and there was actual television. She was like trying to change it. She's like, why is this on? Why is it? Because it was actual television. We hadn't had television. We only watched things, so she could always speed up or go backwards, or she had no idea that there was actual broadcast television. And I think in that context, actually the things like, sports events or like Emmys are these amazing moments where we feel like everyone else is watching this at the same time. And we have so few things like that. So I think that museums and art objects can function that way. And I think just with children, I think that, one of the most important things for us to do as humans, and this country in particular, is to make museums totally open, totally accessible to everyone. And because I think that experience is so amazing, and what we need to make it is less rarefied. We need to make it free. We need to make the doors open. We need to let people know that you can walk in. The Guggenheim, I'm sure a huge, probably majority of the city, who people live in the city, do not know that you can enter it. Don't know like how to do that. And that's really what needs to change. School groups need to go there. Educational groups need to go there. so you really grow up, knowing that that's part of your public, part of your culture, part of your everyday.
I love what you say about accessibility, and I think especially using sort of everyday objects. Like the way I feel about museums is the way I feel about gyms, is that they can be intimidating if you've never been in one. They seem elitist. You have to pay lots of money. You're like, I'm not physically fit enough. I don't understand art well enough. Sort of, I can't go inside. So
I hate gyms, by the way. I hate gyms.
There you go.
But I'm allowed in. I just can't stand them.
You want to make sure people don't say the same thing about museums, that, you're a 10-year-old kid, and to your point, like, yeah, you're welcome. Oh, you don't have to interpret this my way. You could interpret it your way. And I feel like your art like toes the line between the physical and the digital, between chaos and order. Like what about those dichotomies is interesting to you? Do they have more in common than we realize? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for me, but I'm interested in hearing what you guys think about this. I mean, the digital is physical. It's not a non-physical thing. This is a crazy, weird dichotomy that people have created. The digital, it's light, like what we're experiencing, and it's light, it's pixels, it's this screen, it's this, it's like, it's organic, it burps, it messes up, it breaks. We know we want to throw our phones across the wall like once a week because they're not behaving. So and anything outside your eyes is physical, right? It's a physical thing. Like the imaginary, and we have an entire interior world that is in our heads, right? But everything that's outside our eyes is physical. So the digital is physical. So what I'm playing around with a lot is making the digital feel more physical. So like making it gritty, making it disappear, making it feel like it's suffering or dying or appearing strong or appearing soft, so that you falling apart. So you see its pieces. So in the Guggenheim, these images that float around, in broad daylight, that trace the space. So you're seeing the digital merge with the real world in this way that I think we're doing anyways. So it's like it's kind of mimicking the way our minds are working, I think, where we see an image on our hand, we see an image on the screen, we see a real person, and that's all being blended in this way. And I'm interested in how that affects how we remember things, how we care about things, how we fall in love, how we feel lost, because it's real, it's already here.
But this also gives a great lens into one of the things we cover on Possible a lot, which is AI. And so, obviously, this blend between, bits and atoms, where they intersect and what the dance is between them, how does this change the idea maybe of what is an art object and what intrinsic value objects have? Does the AI, change this or evolve this in some way?
A very smart friend of mine said to me, I loved your show. You know what I loved about your show? He said it was evidence that AI is not going to take over. Just because he said an AI could never make this. And he said that's the real question. I mean, I think that the humanities and the arts only become more important in the light of the development of AI. Because AI is a tool, it's not a creature. And as a tool, we need the humanities to tame it. And to guide it and to use it in the way that not tame, maybe to understand how it can actually be a huge benefit to society and not a threat. And so that I think is something that the tech and the humanity worlds need to be more in conversation, I think. And it was interesting because I just I have a daughter in college, and there was it was an intro for the parents to when you dropped your freshman off, and it was a bunch of professors who said why I teach, and there was a guy who's in computer science, and he said, actually, I don't care if all of the papers are written in chat, and a lot of kids are doing that. It's like completely in some classes totally allowed, and he said because I think actually most of these classes won't be taught anymore anyways, because we'll let a lot of these STEM classes will become irrelevant, as actually we'll only need the humanities classes because those are the classes that chat won't be able to cover. So I thought that was a kind of interesting radical statement.
Fundamentally, yes, they'll still study both. I completely 10,000% agree with your thing that it's important to bring the humanist in, because much more than, other technologies, this one, affects how we have knowledge, how we we compose ourselves as individuals and societies, how we communicate. It's a language amplifier. And given all of that, it's much more critical than ever. And to have the humanists, as it were, in the loop, not as a, this is bad, stop the AI, which is like, no, that's not going to work out that way. But to say, how do we make it so that it helps us amplify our humanity, be better? What are the ethical considerations? What are the humanist considerations? What are the artistic implications? I think that's the thing. But we'll still have computer science because, by the way, it's just that within a couple of years, the most common programming language is going to be English.
Natural language. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, sort of speaking more on the AI thread is like people are hypothesizing that like one of the great things about AI is that it democratizes art. Like anyone can be an artist with AI. Like, do you agree? You might say like, why do we need AI for everyone to be an artist? Like, how do you see that?
I mean, I entirely disagree. I mean, first of all, I think at the top of any field, creativity is always, when you look at the most interesting things that are happening in any field, creativity is the key ingredient to making it the top of that field. So, creativity is not just part of the arts; it's actually the superpower of anything you do. But I think there are interesting ideas about like the predictive that I actually have questions for you. I mean, I think AI's knowledge base is about making predictions mostly. Is that correct?
Well, it's predictions is correct, and it's actually more of a kind of a reasoning engine than a knowledge base. It happens to have a lot of knowledge in it as part of how the reasoning engine is constructed. And part of the reasoning engine is prediction, because it's a little bit like, what's the next thing? And actually, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about writing about, in a sense, part of what we have with these large language models is we have a kind of a reasoning creative engine that is based off the corpus of our language. And that's the reason I say reasoning engine more than like certainly not a knowledge base. Like that's what most people don't understand, and they think when they're using Pi or ChatGPT, it's like give me Sarah Ze's biography. Like, okay, then of course it looks like it's a knowledge engine versus a what would happen if what would Reid Hoffman's art look like if he was an artist?
Right, much more interesting question. Yeah, so that's I think two of the things that are, when we bring up the question as a visual artist with creativity is, your whole purpose is not to be predictable. So the predictive, that the idea that there's an element of reasoning that's based on the prediction. Like, what can we predict about putting a conversation between Sarah Sze and Reid Hoffman? Like that already is actually derivative. And so the idea of an artwork being derivative in my field is a huge negative, right? Like the derivative, and it always, that's not to say that it isn't always derivative, because it is, right? We're working from a history where even an artist is saying, oh, I thought about Rauschenberg. Oh, I thought about Eva Hesse. Oh, I thought about, Yayoi Kusama, whoever you want to say. And those people are, and if you have an artist who doesn't know that if there's even an artist who wants to do a show at the Guggenheim and comes there and makes a whole bunch of paintings that look exactly like Andy Warhol, you're going to say, you're derivative, right? You're derivative. But you also need to know as a student at a certain point, you can be a great artist. Like when I teach graduate students, every single student comes in, they are great artists. What they need to do is change the game by making something entirely new that we haven't seen. Is that based on past knowledge? Absolutely. But the first thing you probably talk to them about is what's derivative about their work. I think it's been fought over between whether it's Einstein or Picasso, but mediocre artists borrow, great artists steal. But you learn stealing is about being aware of what is derivative and creating something new that's unpredictable out of it. When I'm making the Guggenheim, I do think the things that make it an interesting show are the things that I had no idea were going to happen. So I create all of these systems, and then within that system, I am following the process in this open way where the process starts to tell me what I'm doing. And being in that moment as a human being and reading back from your own process is something that I think those moments of discovery that you have, whether it's scientific or whether it's creative, those moments I actually think are translated to the viewer. I think the viewer says, wow, how could anyone ever have thought of that? And it's really because of that moment. So that's the thing that I think is, a machine that's trying to predict and that is using knowledge that's derivative already is gonna, I don't know, those are things I think that are gonna be hurdles, I would think. But you can tell me because this is not my field. But I'll add one other thing that I think is interesting. So I did a talk with Richard Axel. I don't know if you know him. He's a Nobel Prize winner for discovering how the olfactory works in the brain. He's a neuroscientist, really brilliant person, and also a huge art lover. And he's a professor at Columbia, and I did a talk with him. And he kind of embarrassingly started the talk by saying, I just want you to all know up front, he's very funny too. He's just said, this person I'm standing next to me is actually more important than me. And I'm going to tell you why. And he said, because if I hadn't been alive, somebody would have discovered how the olfactory works in the brain. But if she hadn't been alive, the artwork she's making never would have existed. And that's kind of the crux of the issue here, right?
And how do you think AI changes this landscape? Because it obviously it unlocks a lot more potential creativity because unlike, kind of like the classic thing to be a good artist, you have to have a lot of different kind of physical skills about how you put stuff together. Whereas now, I can kind of think, hey, create an image that's like the equivalent of if Albert Einstein was looking on LSD at black holes, through a silver daguerreotype, and and I can, if I have visual thinking, which not all human beings do, but if one does, one could do something like that. And so the capabilities of using these tools change the landscape of how art's constructed. Does that change the value of art? Does it change what is art? Does it change what is an artist?
So I think a lot of things about that. You said a lot. I think obviously we're both talking about the same idea. It's a tool. It's a tool. You're using a tool. The driver is your question and how interesting your question is. And the tool is something to play with, right? And I think if people get confused by that, that's, they're not, the AI is not the driver. You're the driver by asking the more interesting question, right? So that's one part of that question. I think the second question is, the part of it is speed. Obviously, the speed at which speed is really interesting here. And I think there's been really interesting art created in times of speed. So when you look at like when trains were created, that changed entirely the way. And Einstein was really interesting on that front. He made patent. He worked in a patent office where they had to create patents for clocks because that's the first time we had to all have universal time, because when a train was landing, was arriving in Venice and then going to Rome, actually noon didn't exist in both places. So they had to create universal time. But speed of information during that time changed radically, right? When the airplane was created. And when you look at those periods in our history, they're really interesting artworks about speed and how that changed how we perceived ourselves as humans in the world. That didn't mean that a painting wasn't still as interesting a way to tell you about that, though. So I think that the subject is fascinating, and how we process information as humans when we know that it can come to us at that speed, and what that makes us feel about what it is to be alive on Earth is a really interesting question. But I don't think that it makes, the piano go obsolete. I don't think that it makes, a paintbrush, they're not going to go out of business. I mean, in some ways, the opposite. People are like looking for Kodak films. Those things become more valuable, right? So I think those are very unpredictable. I think that I have like 20 other things to say, but I'll go to the authorship. So authorship, I think, is really interesting because, images come from high, low, they're manipulated. So that's something I'm interested in my work. In the beginning, when I started doing video, they said, oh, you're going to be one of those video artists who needs like the highest level. I love like the high, the low, the manipulated, because that's what we're getting. That's the language. Like, as you said, our visual language is adapting at this incredible rate. The younger you are, the more complex this is, this mixture, this amalgamation of, what kind of images we're getting and how images are replacing our verbal language, obviously, right? We're going back to almost a pictographic language that we started with. So I think that Authorship is really interesting, but I think all of these things are medium for fine arts. I don't think they replace, the artwork itself. We're the ones asking the questions. We have to ask the right questions, and that's what makes it interesting. And if we ask the wrong questions, it's really not interesting and potentially dangerous. We know that.
I mean, it's interesting. I think, again, when people start using AI, they often say that. They often say, well, like, I'm getting junky responses. And it's like, well, you're asking terrible questions. You need to be at that starting point. But so much of the discussion around AI and art has to do with copyright and ownership and, you're stealing my images. And so I sort of can imagine how you would feel, but let me know. If your art was fed into AI and then someone said, can you create a piece in the style of Sarah Sze? And rather than commissioning you personally, they used, these sort of AI derivative pieces. And so let's take a look at some AI-generated art inspired by your body of work right now. Let me describe this for a minute for those who are listening. These AI images show indoor spaces filled with scaffolding, small screens, and models of planets all cluttered together. You can take a look for yourself in the transcript in the show notes.
Oh, yeah, these are cool. I see. People have sent me these before. So for me, I don't have a problem at all with this. When I first started making artworks, I was, doing mostly installation. When I started showing them publicly, it was back in the day in the 90s, early 90s, where you were not allowed to take pictures of artworks. You were not, a guard would come up to you if you had a camera, which was much, much, much less likely because people didn't have cameras in their pockets. And they would say, no, you can't take a picture. And some artists still do that, actually, or they don't want their films on. For me, and I was I actually said, no, these are installations, their world. I'm really interested in how people photograph them, and they will anyways. I feel like it's prohibition with alcohol. It's you can't, people are still going to do it. It's a losing battle. And these are all really interesting. Would I know they weren't my work? 100%. But if this were a film set for a sci-fi movie, I'd be like, that's incredible. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with ownership. Of these, I think they're really interesting. I think copyright will be totally rewritten. I know there's a lot going on, and there's battles going on, but give it 100 years, it's going to be the rules will have to change, because the trade of images has changed radically in the last. It changes every week, and when that happens and people use them, laws have to follow behavior. So that's my own personal feeling. I certainly, if these are life-threatening, if they're, as we know, my husband's an oncologist, if people are dying, if they're being used with warfare, if they're nefarious, that's a real problem. But if they're being used to create, imaginary worlds, wow, that's amazing. So I feel like also my work is just a continuum of everyone else's work anyways. I hope that I'm talking to, it sounds like hubris, but I hope I'm talking to Vermeer. I hope I'm talking to Rembrandt. I hope I'm talking to, Murasaki. I think that's what all artists are doing. And when I go to the Met and I see, a statue with no head, and I have no idea who made it, I don't know what it looked like with the head, and it still moves me. I don't need to know. So I don't think my name is important. I just love that about my public art. People go through LaGuardia, they go through the subway station. They have no idea who made it. I don't care. It's an experience. And I don't think, half the artworks we have from, centuries ago, we don't know the names of the artists, but we're still appreciating, we're still talking to them. We're talking to them as humans. So that's how I feel. But I know that for some artists, especially people who are in design, I think it's a different problem, because you really are reproducing the exact thing and making money off of it. So there are definitely different realms to this where people's livelihoods can be ruined, and I understand that. But for me, I'm more interested in really a much larger contribution to a larger conversation, where if my work gets mashed up, that's a mashup, right? that's interesting to me. That's interesting. I don't post on Instagram, but I have an Instagram account, and I hashtag myself. And I love looking at my work through the eyes of others. And often I find the most beautiful photographs and most beautiful views of my work through other people's that I don't know, and actually have I go in and I rephotograph their photographs because they find these moments that I haven't found. So, there are, again, many different uses of these tools. I'm not using it to promote my own work. I'm using it as an actual camera to see my work, and it's great.
I think your nuance on, look, there's this new tool. It can amplify our humanity. It can be really good. We're always in conversation. It can help conversation, and we just need to be careful about where it has substantive negative impact is exactly right. And I think a little bit of the art versus design is, I think, one interesting possible lens here, because, part of the thing about replacing artists is, you could hire a human being today to say, look at Sarah's piece and make me another version of it. You couldn't resell it, right? Or you have to really, really clear that it's not Sarah, right? That's doing. And I think art has a lot of that kind of that kind of individual creator part of it, which I think is really good. And I think the design part of it, we'll have to sort out how that exactly works. But it could also be around, authentic, the authentic branded thing. But what are you seeing that is good gestures for how people to look at kind of people using AI to enhance their work, to being amplifying themselves, to kind of show, as opposed to because the media is usually full of negative stuff. What are you seeing on the positive side of that?
I mean, this idea of like art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So that was a Walter Benjamin book that talked about like how art, the minute we had mechanical reproduction, we could reproduce things. It changed what the value of art was, and it questioned it.
Pi, could you explain?
Walter Benjamin was a German philosopher, cultural critic, and essayist. He was active in the early to mid-20th century and is considered a key figure in the field of critical theory. Benjamin argued that the widespread availability and reproducibility of art in the age of mechanical reproduction undermined the aura of art. He believed that the uniqueness and authenticity of an original work of art, its aura, was a key factor in its perceived value and aesthetic impact. However, mass production made art more accessible to a wider audience and diminished its sense of rarity and uniqueness. As a result, Benjamin argued that art lost its special status as a sacred object and became more of a commodity, a product of industrial culture. This shift, he claimed, had significant implications for how art was perceived and valued.
So I think that's subject matter, right? Well, this is a subject matter that's really interesting. So if you are a person, like I think, you can only make, I believe that you can only make the art that you make. You can go and say, I really wish I could say, I really wish I made like small watercolors. But if I don't, I can't just, it really does come from, I do think having to make the work you make. You don't get to choose. So in that way, it's a very, very, very unique endeavor. So when something is reproduced or reproducibility is part of your subject matter. So if that's something you're interested in, like Warhol was very interested in that, right? He made a passion out of that. And his work, it brings up all those questions about, well, if I have it printed on a mug and I enjoy it, like, is that where's the value? And he played with the value of that. So like he took Brillo boxes and he signed them and he sold them for $100 and he threw them out there. And now, he played on that. So you could make that the subject of your work, I think, but I don't think that, I think that there is a difference between a visual thing, whether it's, a painting, an object, digital, I don't care, anything else on your eyes, music, it could be writing, that makes you have this profound moment where you feel connected to humanity over centuries. And that's a very specific kind of art. That's very specific. It's not saying it doesn't deny other kinds of art or other mediums, but it's a very specific endeavor. And And I don't think AI will ever replace that. I just don't. It may be really great at like at things that are like driven, like, graphic design. Like, can it make the golden arches of a McDonald's? Maybe. But also graphic design is also one of these incredible things where there's some things that like no one would ever guess would be successful, right? So these things you don't like. That's what great great advertisers are doing all the time. They actually find things that are not obvious and that really like that link onto things. And so that's the human experiment thing about when you put something out there and you really just don't know. You don't know what it's going to be. And so if it's predictable or if it's reasonable, it's not always going to be the most interesting thing. And I think humans are really, they take that, they're going to occupy that.
Have you had any kind of play yet with any of the kind of AI art tools? And is there anything that you discovered that you thought was particularly like, this really opens up, like, for example, opens up a concept of time and space, which I know you think about a lot, or memory, which I know you also think about a lot?
So there's so many, I get so many offers all the time. And I have been, it's funny. I remember I was like asked to do, I did an AR piece during COVID because I felt like people aren't allowed, they can't get out of their houses. They can't experience these things. I did a piece in Paris and it was closed. No one could go see it. So we did an AR piece where that piece came to your house. Like you held up your camera and all of a sudden these images were flying around your own house. So there's ways in which you can, of course, I think half the shows I see, I think I've seen them virtually, right? You can't remember if you've seen that show or not. It's actively part of seeing artwork, I think, already. But I have been very resistant to diving in because I've felt like I haven't found one where I felt like it was more interesting than the tools. I'm more interested in you going into one of my shows and thinking about, oh, what's happening? There's this confusion between whether it's digital or physical, and having this live moment. So for example, in the Guggenheim, there's a pendulum that's rocking, and underneath it, over the sand, there's a video that has a random path of a moon, and your eye keeps trying to make the pendulum and the random path meet. Though if you think, when you spend time with it, you realize, okay, there's no relationship. That's a video that's already been pre-programmed. That's a pendulum that has, it has an arm that's making it swing at random. But you can't stop it. Your head keeps trying to make them a shadow of one another, magnetized, talking to each other. And so for me, that was this incredible moment that I'd found actually in a different piece, in a Paris piece, and said, this is great. I found this. I'm going to bring it in. Is a kind of real-time example of how I feel a lot, where I'm like, did this happen? Did this happen real time? Is it digital? Is it not? And this is one of my favorite questions to ask younger people. And I dare any of you to do it. What's a time where you were in your day where you were confused about whether something was digital or physical? And they tell you the most amazing answers. So this one kid said to me, it's when I'm going home on the subway, and when I go under the water to go to Brooklyn, and I'm reading a book, and I think the book's going to go dead. So he's already gone backwards. He's made the physical into the digital, and he anticipates it shutting off. And so this is the experience of our world, and that is we are completely digitally dependent. We know that, all of us, right? And it's knitted into our worlds, even, and it became cross ages. Like my parents learned how to order groceries because they had to. So COVID accelerated that even more, right? And so we really have to figure out, what is that doing to the way we communicate, and put it, and think about it, ask questions about it. So, and I don't even mean this in a negative way. I always think about what I'm about to say. I don't think of this in a negative way, but it'll be interesting, Reid and Aria, if you think this is negative. I like to think about different mediums and what they do best. Like, what can a sculpture do really well? Like, it can deal with gravity, you can deal with your body in space, you understand it, you can go around, you can touch it. Whereas like a photograph, you never get what's on left or right. So it creates this, our painting, can create deep space. I put my paintings in my house and they all look bigger. I put a sculpture and I have no space. There are these things that they do. So what I think the digital does for artistically, for me more than anything, is it creates longing. And and I don't mean that in a negative way, because longing is a deep human experience that, as you can look at like Durer's Melancholia. I mean, because the digital I think, always leaves you wanting more. You want to know what it smells like. You want to touch it. You want more. You want the full experience, and you think you have it. It can trick you to have, but you're not there. So I think that longing and then longing can be great. I do all of my yoga classes digitally. I go on Zoom, and I actually love it because I'm private and I don't have to travel. And she looks at the screen and she tells me stuff. And so I'm with her and I'm with this group around the world in different time. We're doing this thing together. It's the most physical thing I do in my day, and actually works out to be a COVID, these COVID holdovers where you're like, actually, I don't want to do this in person. I like this. And it's like the last thing I would have thought was in person. So and it creates this kind of community, but privacy at the same time. So they're really interesting things, I think, that come from it, but they're not always what you expect. But I think longing is the it's the superpower of the digital, and we have longing all the time. It's what it makes. Does AI have longing? I don't know about that. Like, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, we ask, does it have empathy, but does it long to be something? I think probably longing has something to do with the fact that we have knowledge of our own expiration dates, so that and that's something that an AI doesn't have. Or you can try and teach it, obviously, but like, does it actually feel it in a soulful way? We don't know, right? Can we do that? I mean, those are the endpoints, right? Those are the outer edges.
So funny. Everything you said resonated with me. I mean, whenever we go in the car with my kids and they don't understand that their laptop can't have internet, because to them, the internet is nothing because it's everything. Like that doesn't even occur to them. Or I was talking to my husband who's sort of an amateur photographer, and he takes these amazing photos. And when he's editing them, I'm like, Chris, you can't edit them to make it look better than it was. And he goes, I'm not. A photograph can't possibly capture the beauty of where we were in person. And he's like, my editing is just trying to capture that beauty, because the physical and the digital are always in conversation. And I think that's so true. You can't even sort of separate them, because, where does one start and the other end?
I mean, the photography is completely, in the last 50 years, it's completely turned on its head. When I did black and white photography, you had a bunch of negatives. You decided which ones were good. You limited an edition and you destroyed the other ones. Now I think that the photograph is completely disappeared into a moving image, right? It's gone back. So it started, the photograph created the moving image at Reid Hoskins College, which used to be a farm, where they, that's where the first experiments with, Leland Stanford, had a bet that all four legs of a horse were in the air while they were running, and he hired a photographer to actually go and do the Edward Muybridge, to actually create this system where he was photographing on I wonder exactly, and I think it's still there. The ring is still on Stanford, I think, campus. And that's where people think about the first film. The French say, it's a different experiment, but which has happening at the same time with birds. And Marais was doing that experiment exactly the same time, was looking at how birds move. So animals, the photography of animals created film. But I think we're just gone totally backwards now. Like, nobody watches a still image. You're always scrolling. You're always, taking a live image to my 13-year-olds. You never take a still image, because the live you can choose like 25 images, right? So the manipulation of the image is like a painting now. I totally agree with that on your husband. And it's not capturing the moment. It doesn't have, you can't see what's over here. It doesn't have peripheral images. That is what the cubists were doing. The cubists were talking about the fact that when you're in space, everything's moving. Your eyes are moving. There's things fluttering. There's atoms are moving. You're in movement yourself. So a still picture is a fantasy. So then they were talking about how do you paint something and then try and paint it from 10 perspectives at the same time to talk about that idea that we're all in movement. So to me, it's interesting if AI is the subject and is the tool, but I don't think it's the replacement. I don't think it can compete.
What do you think is kind of the path that you're on right now for what you're elaborating? Like, what kinds of themes are you thinking about? What kinds of kind of experiences, memory, time and space? How are you going, which way are you sailing and rowing right now in your kind of experience and mind and creation?
Mm-hmm. So it was really interesting. I did a piece that had to happen right after the Guggenheim opened because of COVID. Everything piled up, and it had to happen really quickly. And there's something really interesting about the limits of time and then making creative decisions that you can't look back on. So I made this piece, and it was like a visual poem, and it actually had a language to it. It was an old Victorian station. It just came down. It's going to Italy. This is called Metronome, and it was caught between two passing trains. But I'm trying to explain what it was. I did a really good podcast with this guy Ben Luke right after it, which I was like, "Wow, it's so interesting." Because again, it was like I couldn't even question what it was. It was so on the top of my tongue, on the tip of my tongue. But I would say what was really interesting to me was it had language in it, and then I decided the language was too literal and took it out. And you have this sense of a rhythm, of a refrain, of chapters in this visual way, and it's complete visual overload. There's about 500 screens all happening at the same time, but they have almost a symphonic quality to them in chapters. And it was a really quick decision to say, okay, the narrative gets taken out. There was a voice, there were people speaking, and it was taken out. And what was left is this actually really interesting rhythmic visual. And it's a very moving piece. I think it has people also like cry in it, and you don't know why. And I think again, it has the sense of sort of loss, of longing, of fragility, of the passing of time. Someone who was very old said, I'm 54, so I'm not that young at all. But someone who was in their 80s said, I don't know how you would make this piece, because it's a piece that an 80-year-old would make, because there's so much about the end of life in it, she said. But I mean, that's not actually what I was, particularly going for in any way. But it was this idea of fragility, of, how fragile life is. So, that it's somehow threaded into this digital narrative. So that's very, very vague, but I'm interested in playing with these tools and seeing and really finding the fragile in them, and then making that moment become a moment for the viewer, and that they recognize that they're like, wait, I know this experience in my real life. Then I know this sense of confusion or loss or finding. And a part of the part of the interesting about losing your footing is also then regaining it. Like, where do you regain, and how those breaks in your life are the things that you remember. So I'm interested in how, how things become valuable in terms of how they imprint on you and your memory, and how they affect how you move forward. Right. So one of the things that's fascinating to me is if you go see art, for me, let's say art, I go, let's say, to San Francisco, look at a bunch of art, and I'm like, I like this. This I was great. This was interesting. This moved me. This didn't. And then I look back at it a month later. There's usually one thing that, and maybe a thing that I didn't think I liked or disturbed me, but one thing that really stayed with me, and I'm going to think about it. It's going to change. So you have to learn things over a long period. Sort of what sticks with you over a long period of time is really interesting. So I'm interested in making that little skip in the record that then imprints, and then having people question what is imprinting and what is changing the way they think along the way.
So moving to our rapid fire section, is there a movie, song, or book that fills you with optimism for the future?
I'm just going to rapid fire. I'm thinking of this. I love this movie, Beast of the Southern Wild. And it's just this incredible movie about resilience. And the acting in it is phenomenal. And it's this mix of documentary and, I mean, it's a fiction film, but a lot of the actors were found on site. And it's about storytelling, memory. Even when we're talking about photography, like the cinematography is absolutely beautiful in it. And it's about humanity. So it's a great movie.
Such a good movie. So this next question, it can be either trivial or deep, whichever you prefer. But what's a question that you wish people would ask you more often?
Interesting. Well, I'm gonna put it in the context of my artwork. I love it when people say, like, it's interesting because people will think, oh, what do you say to someone after you see their work? What do they really want to hear? I do love it when people tell me very specific things that they saw and affected them. Because part of the thing that I'm trying to do with my work is to have an experience that is so diverse that no two people will have the same experience. So that if I ask you and Reid, like, what was your favorite thing about the Guggenheim? And it's just like one little thing, I'm going to rapid fire back. What's the one thing that, Aria, you remember? Like, there's not just one thing that really affected you.
To me, it was the perfect meld of the Guggenheim's space with your artwork. So I couldn't imagine the installation elsewhere because I thought the space spoke to your art and then your art spoke back, which was very cool.
Yeah, I love that because I was like one of the real challenges was how do I make a piece that feels totally married to this building where the building made the work and the work made the building. So that's a great answer, but it could be any answer. Okay, Reid, you're next. I turn the tables.
I find that on the Timelapse, the kind of thinking about what time meant to meaning, and kind of it's like the kind of the all of the everyday objects are kind of like how our everyday life and time combines in the meeting. And so the fact that your perspective changes as you walk around it, as you look towards the wall, you look towards the kind of the complex centerpiece desk / studio / something, right? Exactly what it is. That experience of time had me reflecting on it.
It's beautiful. That's the philosopher in you.
Yes.
Absolutely. But I think the reason why I switched that over is because I think people often think, they say, what does the work mean? Or they want to know the answer from the artist. But I think it's interesting to open and say there isn't, it's really about the experience of the viewer. Like that is as important as what the artist means. As an artist, you have to assume you're not going to be around when the work is there. And so it's really, the art is created by the viewer. To hear, it's the same thing as looking at Instagram photographs. As an artist, to hear what you pick and what you see I wish people would tell me more. I think this is one thing. Like I love this one thing because it's always different. People always have a different, perspective in, and that's really what an artwork is. It's a meeting of your mind with my mind through an object or through an experience.
Where do you see progress or momentum outside of your industry that inspires you?
So I think, for me, of course, progress in the future always resides in children, right? And so I think, I do think that generationally, I'm not sure, and I don't want to make generalizations, but I work with people through all ages, and I have a 13-year-old. So I think that they're trying to ask the questions about how to use these tools in interesting ways. And there is like a kind of real fresh interest in what their potential is. I think that originally there's sort of a generation right after mine, which is sort of which rightly feels like, well, this is what you left us with, like, the environment, these things. But I think the younger generation is really interesting because like in their early 20s, because they are actually very interested in seeing what the potential is, like tearing the thing apart, like turning it over and looking at it from all sides.
Well, on that note, that this can also be sort of focused on art or much more broad. But can you leave us with a final thought on what you think it's possible to achieve if everything breaks humanity's way, if everything goes right in the next 15 years? And what's our first step to move in that positive direction?
I think culture is our greatest. It's what we're going to leave if we're found by another planet. it's what's gonna be the most interesting thing is going to be, listening to pictures from an exhibition. That's going to be our stamp of time. It's going to be looking at a Georgia O'Keeffe. Those are the things that are going to be our time capsule. And so I think, even if, and that I guess I'm talking about if everything doesn't go our way and there's just this little time capsule left, like that's what we want to have in it, I think. So to me, this idea that art is sustenance, that art is an expression of what it is to be alive on Earth. For that to be sort of I'm doing it in the opposite. I'm saying that's what remains. But if we could make that be a language and thread that language more deeply into the future culture that we're creating, I think that would be a great way to go.
Possible is produced by Wonder Media Network, hosted by Aria Finger and me, Reid Hoffman. Our showrunner is Sean Young. Possible is produced by Edie Allard, Sarah Sze, and Paloma Moreno Jimenez. Jenny Kaplan is our executive producer and editor.
Special thanks to Katie Sanders, Surya Yalamanchili, Saida Sapieva, Ian Ellis, Greg Beato, and Ben Rellis. And a big thank you to Kristen Graham and Little Monster Media Company.